November 23, 1942. Kalach on the Don, Soviet Union. The snow began to fall at dawn, light at first, then heavier, covering the frozen steppe in a blanket of white that muffled all sound. Soviet tank crews watched from their T-34s as two columns converged on the small town of Kalach, one from the north, one from the south. When they met, the soldiers dismounted, embraced, and cheered. Behind them, stretching back toward Stalingrad, lay a pocket of encirclement that contained over 250,000 German soldiers. The trap had closed. Hundreds of miles from home, surrounded by an enemy they had underestimated, the men of the Wehrmacht's 6th Army found themselves cut off from supply, from reinforcement, from hope. What followed was not merely a battle, it was a slow-motion catastrophe, a descent into frozen hell that would claim an entire army and shatter the myth of German invincibility forever. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from, and how long could you have survived in those conditions? The winter trap that doomed Hitler's forces did not spring shut overnight. It was the culmination of months of miscalculation, hubris, and strategic overreach that began in the scorching heat of summer 1942. Operation Blue, Hitler's grand offensive to seize the Caucasus oil fields and the city bearing Stalin's name, had started with confidence and momentum. German forces swept across the southern steppes, crushing Soviet resistance and advancing hundreds of kilometers in just weeks. The 6th Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, was considered one of the finest fighting forces in the world, battle-tested, disciplined, and seemingly unstoppable. By late summer, Paulus's army had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad, a sprawling industrial city that stretched for 30 miles along the western bank of the Volga River. The city was a vital transportation hub and manufacturing center, home to tank factories, steel plants, and armament works. Its capture would not only sever Soviet supply lines, but deliver a devastating psychological blow. Hitler became obsessed with taking the city, not for strategic reasons alone, but because it bore Stalin's name. The Führer wanted to humiliate his rival, to plant the swastika on the ruins of Stalingrad, and prove to the world that National Socialist Germany was invincible. Before bombing, for all its ferocity, it created an unexpected problem for the Germans. The rubble, millions of tons of shattered brick, twisted steel, and pulverized concrete transformed the city into a defender's paradise. Every collapsed building became a fortress. Every crater offered cover. The streets, choked with debris, became impassable to tanks. The Wehrmacht would have to take Stalingrad block by block, building by building, room by room. General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Soviet Army, established his headquarters in a dugout on the bank of the Volga, within earshot of the German guns. A stocky, aggressive officer with a reputation for ferocity, Chuikov understood that conventional tactics would fail in the ruins. He developed a strategy he called hugging, keeping Soviet forces so close to German lines that the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb without hitting their own troops. His soldiers fought at ranges measured in meters, sometimes sharing the same building with their enemies, Germans on one floor, Soviets on another. Hand grenades were rolled up and down stairwells. Firefights erupted in hallways. Men stabbed each other in darkened cellars. One of the most famous defensive stands occurred at Pavlov's house, a 4-story apartment building near the city center. In late September, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and his platoon fortified the structure and held it for 58 days against repeated German assaults. They knocked holes through walls to create hidden passages, positioned machine guns in every window, and laid mines around the perimeter. German infantry threw themselves at the building again and again, supported by tanks and artillery. Each assault was repulsed. Soviet propaganda later claimed, with considerable exaggeration, that more Germans died trying to take Pavlov's house than died taking Paris. But the symbolic power was real. A handful of determined men in a single building had become a microcosm of Soviet resistance. By October, the fighting had consumed the Red October steel factory, the Barikady gunworks, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor plant. Workers armed themselves and fought alongside soldiers. Tanks rolled off the assembly lines directly into combat, unpainted and sometimes without gun sights. Women operated anti-aircraft batteries on factory roofs. The battle became a grinding, brutal stalemate. German casualties mounted daily. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Replacements arrived in a trickle. And as October gave way to November, the first snows began to fall. Paulus believed he was on the verge of victory. His forces controlled 90% of the city. Soviet defenders clung to a narrow strip along the Volga, in some places only a few hundred meters wide. One more push, German commanders told themselves, and Stalingrad would fall. But the Sixth Army was exhausted. The men were hollow-eyed, dirty, and increasingly demoralized. Many had been fighting continuously for months. They slept in rubble, ate cold rations, and watched their comrades die for gains measured in meters. Winter clothing had been promised, but never arrived. The first cases of frostbite appeared in field hospitals. What the Germans did not know was that hundreds of miles to the north and south, in the freezing darkness of the steppe, the Soviet High Command was preparing the hammer blow that would change everything. General Georgy Zhukov stood before a map in a dimly lit bunker outside Moscow, studying the situation at Stalingrad with his characteristic intensity. Short, stocky, and utterly ruthless, Zhukov had earned Stalin's trust by halting the German advance at Moscow the previous winter. Now, as Deputy Supreme Commander of Soviet forces, he had been tasked with turning the tide at Stalingrad. Alongside General Alexander Vasilevsky, Zhukov developed a plan so audacious that even Stalin hesitated before approving it. The operation was codenamed Uranus. The plan was deceptively simple. Launch two massive armored thrusts that would smash through the weaker Romanian armies holding the flanks north and south of Stalingrad, then converge deep behind German lines, encircling the entire Sixth Army. It was a classic double envelopment, the kind of maneuver the Germans themselves had executed so brilliantly earlier in the war. Now the Soviets would use German tactics against them. The preparations took weeks and were conducted in absolute secrecy. Over 1 million Soviet troops were assembled in the darkness of the steppe. Thousands of tanks, primarily T-34s, the workhorses of the Red Army, along with heavy KV-1s, were transported by rail and hidden in forests and ravines. Artillery pieces were moved into position under cover of night. Radio silence was enforced. Reconnaissance flights were kept away from the concentration areas. Soviet intelligence knew the Germans suspected something, but not where or when. The Achilles heel of the German position was obvious to anyone who studied the map. The Sixth Army's flanks were held not by Germans, but by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units. These Allied forces were poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and demoralized by the harsh conditions and endless fighting. They lacked anti-tank weapons, their artillery was outdated, and their morale was brittle. German commanders repeatedly requested reinforcements for these sectors, but every available unit was committed to the assault on Stalingrad itself. The flanks would have to hold. Romanian soldiers manning positions north of Stalingrad could feel something coming. Prisoners captured in small raids spoke of massive Soviet buildups. Deserters reported seeing endless columns of tanks moving into position. But when Romanian commanders passed these warnings to German headquarters, they were dismissed. The Soviets, German intelligence insisted, were too weakened by the fighting in Stalingrad to launch a major offensive. It was wishful thinking of the most dangerous kind. At 7:30 a.m. on November 19, 1942, the sky north of Stalingrad erupted. Over 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces and rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously in one of the most devastating bombardments of the war. Katyusha multiple rocket launchers, nicknamed Stalin's organs for their distinctive wailing sound, unleashed salvos that tore through Romanian positions. Heavy howitzers lobbed shells that cratered the frozen earth. The barrage lasted 80 minutes. Romanian soldiers huddled in their trenches, praying, weeping, some going mad from the sheer violence of the onslaught. Communication lines were severed. Command posts were obliterated. Officers were killed before they could issue orders. When the barrage lifted, the tanks came. Hundreds of T-34s, their broad tracks churning through snow and mud, crashed through the Romanian Third Army's defensive line. The T-34 was a revelation, fast, maneuverable, with sloped armor that deflected most Romanian anti-tank rounds. Behind the tanks came waves of Soviet infantry, advancing in human masses, absorbing casualties, closing the distance, overwhelming positions through sheer weight of numbers. The Romanians fought bravely in places, desperately in others, but they were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and terrified. By the end of the first day, the northern front had collapsed. Soviet spearheads had advanced 50 kilometers. General Paulus received the first reports with disbelief, then alarm. He ordered German units to move north to plug the gap, but it was too late. The Soviets were already deep in the German rear, overrunning supply dumps, airfields, and headquarters units. Radio messages grew increasingly frantic. Units reported being surrounded. Others simply went silent. The next morning, November 20th, 1942, the southern pincer struck. Soviet forces smashed into the Romanian Fourth Army south of Stalingrad with equal fury. Again, the Romanians broke. German reserves rushed to contain the breakthrough, but were swept aside. The 29th Motorized Division fought heroically, but was overwhelmed. The 4th Panzer Army, supposed to be the mobile reserve, was caught dispersed and unable to concentrate its strength. Soviet tank columns drove westward at breakneck speed, covering 30 kilometers in a single day. German commanders scrambled to understand what was happening. Maps at headquarters were marked with red arrows showing Soviet advances, but the arrows kept moving, kept extending, kept pushing deeper. Some officers recognized the danger immediately. If the two Soviet pincers met, the Sixth Army would be trapped. Paulus radioed Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the Army Group commander, requesting permission to begin a fighting retreat. But Hitler's orders were clear: hold Stalingrad at all costs, no retreat. On November 22, 1942, near the town of Kalach-on-the-Don, Soviet tank crews from the northern and southern spearheads made contact. They embraced, fired flares into the sky, and celebrated. Behind them, the trap had closed. Over 290,000 German and Axis soldiers, the entire Sixth Army, along with supporting units, were surrounded in a pocket roughly 50 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers deep. The largest encirclement in military history was complete, and winter was just beginning. Inside the pocket, the initial reaction was confusion rather than panic. German soldiers had experienced encirclements before and had always been relieved or broken out. Surely this would be no different. Paulus and his staff immediately began planning a breakout operation. Every senior officer agreed
The Sixth Army had to attack westward immediately before the Soviet ring solidified, before supplies ran out, before winter truly set in. Time was everything. Paulus drafted a message to Hitler requesting permission to break out. He explained the situation carefully. The army had supplies for perhaps 2 weeks if rationing was strict. Ammunition was limited, winter equipment was non-existent. The Volga was beginning to freeze, flooding off the last Soviet escape route, but also blocking German access to water. Every day of delay would cost lives and reduce the chance of success. Hitler's reply came swiftly. The Sixth Army would not retreat. It would form a hedgehog defense and hold until relieved. Fortress Stalingrad would tie down Soviet forces and prevent them from exploiting the breakthrough elsewhere. And Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had personally guaranteed that his aircraft could supply the pocket by air. The Reichsmarschall, desperate to restore his tarnished reputation, promised to deliver 500 tons of supplies daily, the minimum calculated to sustain the trapped army. It was a fantasy. The Luftwaffe was already overstretched on multiple fronts. Transport aircraft, primarily Junkers 52 trimotors, obsolete and vulnerable, would have to fly through increasingly dangerous Soviet airspace. The weather was deteriorating rapidly. Airfields inside the pocket were primitive, often just strips of frozen earth, and 500 tons per day was an almost impossible target, even under ideal conditions. But Hitler believed Göring. Or perhaps he simply could not bring himself to order a retreat from a city bearing Stalin's name. Either way, the decision was made. The Sixth Army would stay. General Paulus was a man trapped between loyalty and reality. A career staff officer, meticulous and obedient, he had never disobeyed an order in his life. Some of his subordinates urged him to ignore Berlin and break out on his own authority. General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, commander of LI Corps, even began withdrawing his units without permission, hoping to force Paulus's hand. But Paulus countermanded the order. "I am a German officer. I obey orders." It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The airlift began on November 25th. Ju-52s lumbered into the pocket, carrying crates of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The first missions were almost successful, delivering nearly 100 tons. But Soviet fighters, Yak-1s, Lag-3s, and American-made P-39 Airacobras, flown by increasingly skilled pilots, began intercepting the transports. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the pocket. Planes were shot down in flames, their crews killed instantly or freezing to death in the wreckage. Others crashed in blizzards or were destroyed on the ground by Soviet artillery. The daily tonnage delivered quickly fell below 100 tons, sometimes dropping to 50 or even less. It was nowhere near enough. German soldiers joked bitterly about the Göring rations. The Reichsmarschall had promised bread, but delivered nothing. Hunger became constant. Rations were reduced again and again. 300 grams of bread per day, then 200, then 100. A slice, a mouthful, nothing. The horses were slaughtered first. There were thousands of them, draft animals used to pull artillery and supply wagons. They were shot, butchered, and distributed to the troops. Horse meat became a delicacy. Men boiled the bones for soup, chewed the hooves, ate the organs. When the horses were gone, they turned to dogs, cats, rats, anything with meat. Leather belts were boiled into a paste. Boot soles were chewed for the calories. One soldier later recalled finding a frozen crow and feeling like he'd discovered treasure. Winter descended with savage intensity. Temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius, then -40. The soldiers of the Sixth Army wore the same summer uniforms they'd marched in 6 months earlier: thin cotton trousers, light jackets, inadequate overcoats. Winter clothing existed. Warehouses full of it sat in rear areas. But the supplies could not be flown in. There wasn't room on the planes. Ammunition took priority, then food, then medicine. Warm clothing was a luxury the dying army could not afford. Frostbite became epidemic. Men lost toes, fingers, ears, noses. Entire feet turned black and had to be amputated. The field hospitals were overwhelmed. Surgeons operated without anesthesia, cutting away dead tissue while patients screamed or bit down on leather straps. Many died from shock or infection. Others simply gave up, lying down in the snow and waiting for the cold to take them. Disease followed hunger. Typhus spread through the cramped bunkers and cellars where soldiers sheltered. Dysentery ravaged units. Men too weak to walk lay in their own filth. Medical supplies were exhausted. Bandages were washed and reused until they disintegrated. Antiseptics ran out. Morphine became a memory. The wounded suffered in silence or screamed until their voices gave out. One German officer, Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Adam, kept a diary throughout the encirclement. In early December, he wrote, "The men are starving. Their faces are gray, their eyes sunken. They move like ghosts. We are living on a cemetery, and we are the corpses that don't yet know they're dead." Outside the pocket, Field Marshal von Manstein assembled a relief force. One of Germany's most brilliant commanders, Manstein understood that time was critical. He gathered the 4th Panzer Army, reinforced with elite units including the 6th Panzer Division, and launched Operation Winter Storm on December 12th. The panzers drove northeast, smashing through Soviet defenses, covering 60 kilometers in a week. By December 19th, they were within 48 kilometers of the pocket, close enough to hear the thunder of 6th Army's artillery, close enough to see the glow of fires on the horizon. Manstein sent an urgent message to Paulus: begin Operation Thunderclap, the planned breakout. Attack southward to link up with the relief force. It was the last chance. If the 6th Army moved now, immediately, most of the men could be saved. But Paulus hesitated. Hitler had not authorized a breakout. The Führer still insisted the army hold Stalingrad. Paulus drafted messages, pleaded for permission, argued that the situation was desperate. Hitler's reply was unequivocal. The 6th Army would not abandon Stalingrad under any circumstances. Hold your positions. Relief is coming. The moment passed. Soviet reinforcements arrived and counterattacked, driving Manstein's panzers back. The 6th Panzer Division, reduced to a handful of operational tanks, was forced to withdraw. By December 23rd, the relief operation had failed. Manstein pulled back to defensive positions. The 6th Army was alone. Inside the pocket, hope died. The soldiers had believed rescue was coming. They had endured the cold and hunger and disease because they thought salvation was just days away. Now they understood the truth. They had been abandoned. Berlin's promises were lies. They were going to die in this frozen wasteland. Christmas 1942 was the bleakest many men could imagine. There were no rations that day, no special deliveries, no gifts from home. Some soldiers sang carols in weak, trembling voices, the words trailing off into silence. Others wrote final letters to their families, though they knew the letters would never be mailed. "My dearest wife, I do not think I will see home again. Tell our children I loved them. Tell them their father died for Germany, though I no longer know what Germany stands for." By the end of December, the 6th Army was disintegrating. Over 40,000 men had already died from starvation, disease, cold, and Soviet attacks. The survivors were living corpses, barely able to stand, their minds retreating into numbness. Some simply walked away from their units, wandering into the snow, and were never seen again. Discipline was breaking down. Officers could no longer enforce orders. Men stayed in their bunkers, too weak to move, waiting for death. On January 8, 1943, Soviet officers approached German lines under a white flag. They carried an ultimatum signed by General Konstantin Rokossovsky, commander of the Don Front: surrender or be annihilated. The terms were surprisingly generous. Prisoners would receive food and medical care. Officers could keep their sidearms and personal belongings. All would be repatriated to Germany after the war. The alternative was clear: continue fighting and die. Paulus forwarded the ultimatum to Hitler, requesting permission to negotiate. The Führer's response was instant and absolute: surrender is forbidden. The Sixth Army will hold its position to the last man and the last round. Your heroic endurance will make an unforgettable contribution in the establishment of a defensive front and the salvation of the Western world. On January 10, 1943, Operation Ring began. 7,000 Soviet artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, pounding the pocket with a bombardment that shook the earth for miles. Then came the infantry and tanks, advancing methodically, crushing German positions sector by sector. The Soviet steamroller had begun its final advance.
The Sixth Army fought back, but it was a hopeless gesture. Units reduced to company strength tried to hold sectors designed for regiments. Machine guns fell silent when the ammunition ran out. Artillery batteries fired their last shells and were overrun. German soldiers, too weak to run, surrendered in groups of dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. White flags appeared across the pocket. Officers negotiated with Soviet commanders, asking only that their men be fed. On January 26th, Soviet forces split the pocket in two, reaching the Volga and isolating the northern and southern groups. Communication between them ceased. Each fought its own desperate battle, without coordination, without hope, without purpose. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, the Führer promoted Paulus to field marshal in a grotesque piece of symbolism. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear: Paulus was expected to commit suicide rather than be captured. But Paulus was done with Hitler's delusions. On January 31, 1943, in the basement of the Univermag department store in central Stalingrad, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered. Soviet officers found him sitting at a table, gaunt and hollow-eyed, looking decades older than his 53 years. "I am Field Marshal Paulus," he said quietly. "I surrender myself and my command." He was taken into custody and driven away. In the north, General Karl Strecker and the remnants of the 11th Corps fought on for 2 more days before they too capitulated on February 2, 1943. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The Sixth Army had ceased to exist. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Of the 290,000 men encircled in November, approximately 91,000 were taken prisoner. Of those, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The rest died in Soviet captivity, from starvation, disease, and forced labor in the gulags of Siberia. They were marched hundreds of miles through blizzards, wearing rags without food or rest. Those who fell were shot. Those who survived faced years of hard labor in mines and forests, living on starvation rations, dying by the thousands. Total Axis casualties at Stalingrad, killed, wounded, captured, or missing, exceeded 850,000. Soviet casualties were higher still, estimated at over 1.1 million military personnel, plus uncounted civilian dead. The city itself was annihilated, reduced to rubble and ash. Not a single building remained intact. The factories were smashed. The streets were unrecognizable.
When the spring thaw came, the Volga ran red with the melted snow washing away months of blood. But the strategic consequences eclipsed even these horrific losses. Stalingrad marked the true turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was shattered forever. German casualties, particularly the loss of an entire field army, could never be replaced. The initiative passed permanently to the Soviets. From this moment forward, Germany would fight a defensive war, retreating slowly but inexorably westward, bleeding men and machines it could not afford to lose until Soviet tanks finally crashed through the gates of Berlin in April 1945. Hitler's reaction to the disaster was characteristic. He raged at his generals, blamed everyone but himself, and refused to acknowledge reality. He forbade the wearing of mourning bands for the Sixth Army. He demanded that Stalingrad be erased from official records. But the German people knew. They heard the rumors, read between the lines of propaganda, and mourned the sons and husbands who would never return. For the first time, many Germans began to understand that the war might be lost. In the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a symbol of resistance, sacrifice, and ultimate victory. Stalin ordered the city rebuilt as a monument to Soviet heroism. The Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that witnessed some of the fiercest fighting, was crowned with an enormous memorial complex. At its center stands the Motherland Calls, a 279-foot-tall statue of a woman holding a sword aloft, one of the largest sculptures in the world. The names of the defenders are carved into stone walls that stretch for hundreds of meters. Every year on February 2nd, survivors return to walk among the monuments and remember their fallen comrades. In 1961, the city was renamed Volgograd as part of Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign. But to the world, it remains Stalingrad. The name is inseparable from the battle. It represents the moment when the tide turned, when the seemingly unstoppable German war machine met an enemy that refused to break and was itself broken. Hans Wegener, the German soldier who scratched that desperate diary entry on November 19th, never saw Germany again. His body was found during the spring thaw, frozen in the ruins where he'd taken shelter. Soviet troops recovered his diary and sent it to their archives. His final entry, undated and barely legible, read, "We came as conquerors. We die as ghosts. God forgive us for what we have done." The winter trap that closed around Stalingrad did not merely destroy an army. It destroyed the illusion that will and ideology alone could overcome logistics, geography, and the fundamental laws of war. Hitler's obsession with symbols, with names on maps, with prestige, and with never retreating, cost Germany its finest army and any chance of victory in the East. The soldiers paid the price for their leader's hubris. They died in the snow, abandoned and forgotten, victims of decisions made in distant headquarters by men who would never face the consequences. Stalingrad reminds us that wars are not won by fanaticism or propaganda, but by the courage of soldiers, the wisdom of commanders, and the terrible arithmetic of attrition. The men who fought there, German and Soviet alike, endured conditions that defy imagination. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as human beings who suffered and died in one of history's most brutal battles. But while Stalingrad consumed Hitler's forces in the east, another catastrophic defeat was unfolding in North Africa, where Field Marshal Rommel's famed Afrika Korps would face its own moment of reckoning against British and American forces at El Alamein. Join us next time as we uncover the desert campaign that turned the tide in Africa and set the stage for the invasion of Italy. Until then, remember those who fought, honor those who fell, and never forget that the price of freedom is paid in blood, sacrifice, and the lives of those who answered the call.